countless studies done on conflict and relationships. And out of that, people who study this stuff found out, and this is pretty much universally accepted in the secular scientific community, and I have found it to be true, that for a relationship to be successful and constructive long-term, there must be a ratio of 5-to-1 positive to negative interactions. In other words, for every negative interaction you have with someone, you need to have 5 positive interactions. And of course, no one keeps count, right? Okay, well, this is positive, so I need to have 4 more of those before we can have an argument. Nobody does that. But we can have a general idea if we look at our relationships. If you find yourself bickering with someone more often than not, more likely that relationship is not as healthy as it could be. On the other hand, relationships where all negativity is avoided at all costs, that too is very, very unhealthy. The most interesting thing about this 5-to-1 ratio to me is that for a healthy relationship to occur, some conflict is necessary. It is. So why is some conflict necessary for a healthy relationship? It's because it's through the conflict that we grow, that we learn what we've done is not good. We talk about this next week in more detail, but the Bible talks about iron sharpening iron. And that's what that means, is that for our relationships to be healthy, sometimes some good constructive pushback or conflict is very necessary. Our relationships with the Lord should be a model for all of our relationships on this earth. The Lord does not allow a believer to just walk through their life without challenging them on certain issues, right? We mess up. Our interpersonal relationships, meaning relationships between 2 people, are exactly the same. If we try to avoid all negativity, that is not a healthy situation. Now, all of that said, to have constructive conflict that builds relationships, the conflict itself must be healthy, more often than not. And we all have times, as I said, where destructive conflict can occur. Hopefully, though, the more we become aware of the unhealthy conflict, the more we can work to avoid that to where it will be less often. And when it does happen, we'll be quick to repair it. So let's talk. So that's the positive to negative ratio, 5-to-1. Does everybody understand what I'm talking about when I say why conflict is necessary in some relationships? Everybody get that? Okay. So strategies for constructive conflict. This is the second one. Under this category, we're going to discuss 3 things that we can do in order to have constructive conflict. Now, these 3 things are things that mainly focus on us, things that we can do, right? You and I, individually, to do our part in any relationship, whether that's marriage, a family member, or even here at church. Okay? And actually there are 4 of them, 4 strategies for constructive conflict. I apologize. I'm going to read them to you, then we'll go through each one individually. 1 is to manage strong emotions. Man, that's hard. 2nd is to be a good listener. The 3rd is to practice forgiveness. And the 4th, and this is the one I lost, is to let go of control, right? And so let's go through each one of these. And since becoming your pastor, I've talked a lot about the importance of forgiveness, the importance of making sure, pardon me, I had gum in my mouth, making sure that we forgive those around us. But I've not really mentioned the other ones. I haven't talked a lot about that. Not too many sermons are applicable to managing strong emotions, being good at listening. Some I could see at listening, some at letting go of control. But as far as our day-to-day relationships are concerned, managing strong emotions, letting go of control, being a good listener, man, those things are vitally, vitally important. And these are the things that we can't make another person do. As much as we might try, and this has to do with control, as much as we might try to want to have our friend or our spouse be a good listener, We can't control them. And so what we do is we do our part. We do our part. And the Lord will honor that, I believe. So the first one is managing strong emotions. This is a tough one. It used to be really, really tough for me. The ability to manage strong emotions is gained over a long period of time, I believe. To be honest, it should start at childhood, where we are trained as children to manage strong emotions. But most of us were not trained to do so when we were children, that's for sure. And this is doubly difficult for a person that may have certain mental struggles, that may be on medication for something going on chemically up in their brain, because that does exist. I've noticed that some people are prone to outward bursts of strong emotion, but other people keep that strong emotion on the inside. But both are strong emotions that need to be managed. Oftentimes the attention goes to the person who has the outbursts, right? For example, Laura and I in our marriage, like in 23 years, I've never heard Laura yell. Not one time, ever. But she's heard me yell plenty of times. Does that mean she doesn't have strong emotions? Absolutely not. That's right. She bottles them. She will bottle them. And then it will come out 6 months down the line, right? But even then, she doesn't yell. But it doesn't mean that she doesn't have strong emotions. She has very strong emotions. The inability to manage our strong emotions is what leads to addictions, whether that be drugs, alcohol, food, sex, shopping, all sorts of addictions that strong emotions lead to, right? Those strong emotions, when we have those in our lives, we don't know how to manage them, then we go to things and we seek comfort, right? When we feel emotionally overwhelmed. Like most things in life, Christ was the example that we should look to when it comes to managing our emotions. We see a few times in Scripture, which I'll point to next week, where Christ became angry or sad, and he wasn't afraid to show it, right? On the other side of the coin, we can look at a guy like Samson, or the beginning of Peter's ministry. He gets better over time, where we see outbursts of unhealthy emotion, right? And especially in Samson, right? He gets angry and he lashes out, right? And he does destruction, things that the Lord did not tell him to do. So a quick story for you here. So for many years, you may not believe this, but it's true, I struggled with explosive anger. I did. I struggled with it. As a kid, I would get into a lot of physical confrontations with other kids, a lot of physical fights due to that anger. Not being able to manage my anger is one of the reasons that I got involved in some really bad stuff. And even after getting married and having Sam, I would really struggle with getting overly angry and having outbursts, yelling. Sam and Laura would tell you, you can ask them, I have spilled many tears over my anger because I would get angry, have an outburst, and man, the Lord would just hit me hard. I would feel so bad after losing my temper. I would. More than once, I actually lost a job because I would get so angry at my boss. It was after my first job in the ministry, though, that the Lord really started working on me in this area. My first ministry job didn't end well because of my temper. And I won't get into exactly what happened, but there was some really bad stuff going on in that church. Some obvious favoritism going on between the lead pastor and the other staff members that I worked with. Okay? And for a while, I just tried to ignore it, meaning bottle it down. But I couldn't. So one day, I respectfully brought up the issue to my boss, the lead pastor. And he did not respond well at me, right? And matter of fact, he defended the favoritism. And as a result, I got angry and I did not manage my emotions very well at all at that moment. And I ended up quitting that job because of my anger. And it was after this that I really started to seek the Lord. for help in this area. See, my goal back then, as it always has been since a little kid, was to lead a church one day. But I knew that I would never be able to do that if I didn't control this area of my life. Or I should say, allow the Lord to control this area of my life. I knew my anger would prevent that from ever happening. See, the problem with strong emotions, whether it be outbursts or internal, is that they end up hurting other people, not just us. Slowly over time, the Lord began changing me, teaching me, giving me the ability to better handle my emotions. And it happened slowly. It was over a period of probably 7-8 years. A few weeks ago, Andy was over at our home playing some video games. I've spent some good time with him, and we got to talk about something. I forget what it was. I don't remember. But he said to me, "You never get angry." And I said to him, "You be around me enough, and you'll see that that's not true." But in that moment, I realized how far the Lord had brought me in this area. That this kid that had been at my house for multiple hours and multiple times had never seen me get angry, right? I'd venture to say most of you have never seen me get angry, like really angry, right? And I realized just how far the Lord had brought me in this area. And I don't think I would be standing here today if the Lord hadn't worked on me in that area. Now, you know that I don't like to, I usually don't praise myself a lot, but this is one area like that the Lord has really, really done an amazing job in my life. Anger isn't the only strong emotion, though. I mentioned that. For some, it's sadness and depression. Yeah. That can be an overwhelming strong emotion, right? Racing thoughts that keep us up at night can be a really, really strong emotion, just to give a couple examples. Another reason that managing our emotions is important is because it's normally these emotions that cause us to say things that we shouldn't during conflict. The Bible says, "Be slow to speak, slow to anger." It's these same emotions that cause us to oftentimes be overly sensitive, too. Have you ever tried joking with your spouse when they're angry? Typically, it usually doesn't turn out very good. When we're experiencing strong emotions, we can become very sensitive to what people are saying to us. So managing our strong emotions is important if we want to have constructive conflict. It's one of the keys, as a matter of fact, to having constructive conflict is managing our emotions. The second one is being a good listener. So managing our strong emotions, being a good listener. And this is the second area that is really helpful if we want to have constructive conflict in our relationships. One of the interesting scientific studies that we had to examine in my class found that couples who laughed together had healthier long-term relationships. What does this have to do with being a good listener? Well, in this study, they found that as long as one person in the relationship was a good listener, the more likely that couple would be able to laugh together. If you have two people who aren't good listeners, more than likely you're not going to find a lot to laugh and joke about in your relationship, right? Because you're both vying for that what's called the power of the position of power. I mean, I'm constantly trying to dominate my partner, right? We don't think of it that way, but that's exactly what it is. Right. When we don't want to listen to people in our lives. And so laughing together, and as long as one person was able to be a good listener. And this is what I mean by these things we can't force our partners to do, or our friends, but if we do our work and submit to the Lord and do these things, I believe that the Lord will honor that. I will say that one good thing about my marriage, Laura and I, is that we've always been able to laugh together, often at each other. And practicing the ability to shut our trap and genuinely listen to what our friend, our spouse, or our children are trying to say will go a long way in having constructive conflict. Mm-hmm. While going to school and to become a pastor, one of the things that was pounded into our heads in seminary is the importance of listening to the people that you serve. And you've all noticed that sometimes I can be overly critical of other churches, other pastors, and that I've worked with or have seen. Sometimes I can get over my skis on this. But I will say this. I haven't met too many pastors that I can think of that I've worked for or otherwise that aren't pretty good listeners. Matter of fact, this is a calling or a job that pretty much, if you're not a decent listener, like, you won't last long.
That's right.
Because it's an important part of making sure that you're able to serve people. And I will also say that when we can't manage our strong emotions, it's hard for us to be a good listener. Because we're constantly thinking of things that make us angry, or that make us sad, or that make us depressed. So I think that that's good. Sometimes we can become so wrapped up in ourselves that when we're around our friends or loved ones, we forget to listen. Or if we do listen, we're sitting there thinking about what we want to say right after they're done. When I was a kids pastor, one of the things I would do with the kids is how to listen to one of their peers. And we would do this contest. I would pair them up. I would sit them down, they facing one another, and one of them would talk. I would give them a topic for 2 solid minutes. The other child couldn't say anything, right? And I really encouraged them not to think about what they were going to say because they didn't know their topic, right? And so the kid sat down in front of the other kid, listened to him talk, and after one kid would speak, then the other one who listened had to rephrase what that kid said back to them. Whoever I thought did the best in this area and rephrased it the best and listened the best would get a prize, is what I did. And why did I do this? It was to teach them how to be a good listener. It was. A lot of that stuff isn't taught at home, that's for sure. I know I didn't learn it when I was a kid, that's for sure. And my parents were great, but they never really taught us to be good listeners. So that's why I would do it. And one of the best ways to become a good listener is when we are talking with someone, listening to someone, we find a way to rephrase what that person said to us, to let them know that we were listening to them, to pose a question based on what they said to us, right? For example, my wife comes home from a full day of teaching. I ask her how her day goes. Typically, I will do that. She responds by saying it was a good day, but she had some trouble with one of her students, let's say. A good listener would respond to that by saying, well, I'm glad that you had a good day. Which student gave you the most trouble, right? A bad listener would say, great, my day was fine too. Thanks for asking. I've done that. Right? We don't think about it. We just do because there's something on our minds that we want to get off. When a loved one comes to us, let's say that they're angry at something we did, often our response is to become defensive and react accordingly instead of just listening. When we practice good listening skills, we can train ourselves to first manage our emotions, because that's important, and then listen quietly to what they have to say. Sometimes it's so difficult to hold our tongue, but it's really important. And the reason that conflict often becomes destructive is because we fail to manage our emotions, and then we fail to practice being a good listener. And I say practice because all of these things take practice. Unless the Lord wants to do an absolute miracle and make you a good listener and a good manager of strong emotions overnight, which He is more than capable of doing, but He generally doesn't because we won't learn anything. The third area in this is practicing forgiveness. And I've spoken a lot about forgiveness, so I won't spend as much time on that. I will speak more about forgiveness next week because this is such a vital part of having constructive conflict. I find it interesting in my book, which is 100% secular, how it talks about forgiveness and how it's an important part of our relationship with other people. That's right. Forgiveness is a biblical concept, right? Even secular society recognizes that being able to forgive people is good and healthy. And it's the only way in order to have constructive conflict. Without operating in an attitude of forgiveness, it's virtually impossible to manage our strong emotions or to be a good listener. Forgiveness is a main part of that. So if a secular academic book points out how important forgiveness is, how much more should a believer walk this out in their life? We should be the examples of ultimate forgiveness. And I can't overstate how much forgiveness plays a role in any constructive conflict. If you've ever known anyone that struggles in this area, then you have seen just how destructive unforgiveness can be. Man, it can be ugly. I don't think that the church addresses this topic enough or takes forgiveness as seriously as it should. The Bible talks very seriously about operating in forgiveness. As a matter of fact, it's one of the most seriously talked about subjects as far as the consequences of not forgiving. I don't want to walk in that. Let's keep moving forward here. Those are 3. So managing strong emotions, being a good listener, and forgiveness. And then the last one that I have in this particular area is letting go of control. Letting go. And this is the one I lost, right? So I wrote a little bit when I got here, and I put this. I said, different people can struggle with issues of control. For some, control is not an issue to them. For other people, they like to have control. For some, they inherently want to try to control situations or people. Often, people like this can struggle with trust, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes it comes out of a sense of anxiety, right? They're feeling anxious and they want to be able to control the situation in order to minimize that anxiety. But for those that do struggle in this area, it's an important area to work on in our life. And this is where, my book talks a lot about this, and this could be a whole different series of teaching. That in order to really combat an issue of control, other than dealing with it biblically, which is very important, it's to find out where that controlling behavior comes from. At what point in your life did you begin to think, if I don't control this situation, the outcome is not going to be what I want? There is something in your life somewhere along the way. Now, this is getting a little bit into psychoanalytics and stuff like that, and I'm not really into that stuff. But I think it's a valid point nonetheless, is to look at ourselves, do some self-reflection, right? And find out what is causing us to want to be able to want to have to control as much as we do. Because here's the things. If we are constantly seeking to control a situation or another person or the relationship or whatever, guess what we're not going to be good at? Listening at all. More than likely, we're not going to be very good at forgiving. Although I have known some people that struggle with control that recognize it in their life and that can forgive, pretty good. Managing strong emotions is another one, that is, you're going to have a hard time with if you're seeking it, because if something is out of your control, that immediately brings in anxiety, and you want to be able to stamp down that situation to where you want to control it. And so I will tell you this. I don't think that the Lord is pleased with this in a person. We all have a desire to control things to a degree, but when it gets so bad that we end up hurting other people around us because we seek to control the situation so much, this is where it can get, out of balance, and I don't believe that the Lord is pleased with that. So that's what I have for you on control. I had a whole lot more and a couple examples, but I don't want to get into that because I don't have them in front of me. If you know anything about me, Joe knows this. If it's not in front of me, I'm not going to do it, because there have been a few times where I get off on some subject and I end up saying something I shouldn't. So I'm gonna stick with what I got in front of me. So let's go to elements of constructive conflict. Now, The elements of constructive conflict are related in large part to the ones that we just talked about, strategies for constructive conflict. In fact, in order to be able to institute the elements of healthy conflict, we must first employ the strategies of healthy conflict. Because if we cannot manage our emotions, if we're not a good listener, if we can't walk in forgiveness, and if we like to control every situation, it will be almost impossible for us to implement the elements of healthy conflict into our relationships. Let me also say this, that it is important to know this, that you cannot control your friend, your other person, you cannot control them, right? And so if we're doing our part, that will go a long way in helping us have a healthy conflict or healthy relationship. My book listed many elements of constructive conflict, but I narrowed them down. Let's see. 1, 2, I apologize. Let's see, 1, 2, I think 2. I narrowed them down into 2 overall categories, okay? 1 is to stick to the topic whenever we're having conflict. And 2 is to put yourself in the other person's shoes whenever we're having conflict in our relationship. So these are things that you want to talk to your friend, your spouse, your loved one about when tensions are not high. Meaning that when you are in conflict, in a heated conflict, right, you can't talk about these things. These are important to talk about with your loved one when tensions are not high, okay? But even if the person in your relationship is difficult and doesn't want to, maybe start to employ some of these strategies, if we do our part, right? Well, let me back up. If we have someone in our life that refuses to work with us in these areas outside of marriage, you need to look at how good that relationship is for you outside of marriage. If you're in a marriage where this person doesn't want to work with you, sorry, you're stuck. You're there. You made that choice, right? And we are in a covenant with the Lord. Outside of physical abuse or sexual impropriety, you're there, right? And so I want to make that clear. But if it's another relationship and a person refuses to work with you on making that relationship more healthy, I would encourage you to look at, do you need that relationship in your life? Because that relationship has to go both ways, right? And I just wanted to say that. All right, let's go over the first thing here. And these things that we can do individually and also work with our partner to do, because it really takes both people to do these things, okay? Is to stick to the topic at hand. Whenever you're in a conflict, stick to the topic at hand. It's easy to get off topic when conflict rears its head. I know in my marriage, when a conflict arises, I will immediately remember everything that Laura has done over the length of our relationship, right? That has annoyed me. And that is why forgiveness is important, right? So I'm forgiving them. It may come to my mind, but those strong emotions related with that event will not be there, or will be less, right? The Lord doesn't wipe our memory when we forgive. Those things will be there, but those strong emotions that tie us to that event will not be as strong, right? That's why forgiveness is important. For example, let's use use the example I used in week 1 about me leaving the iron on, right? Anybody remember that from week 1? I know you weren't here, but you were. So I had used an example of me ironing some stuff before we go to church, and I accidentally leave the iron on, okay? So on the way to church, Laura asked me if I remembered to turn off the iron. And I respond with a non-committal answer, like, I'm not sure, but it'll be fine. Don't worry, right? That is something I would probably typically say. This answer does not sit well with Laura. And in this moment, right, she all of a sudden remembers the time last week when she had asked me if I could put my dishes away into the dishwasher, but I didn't do it, right? Because she's immediately in her mind, she thinks of other times where she has asked me to do something and I didn't do it. It will immediately come to her mind, right? It does to all of us. Well, if she's still hanging on to that, either because unforgiveness or because she never brought it up to me in the first place, right? The not putting the dishes away, right? Then she's going to bring that up again. Well, you remember last week I asked you to put the dishes away and you didn't put them away, right? Now, I will tell you, my wife is probably the most lovely person I know, and she would actually never do that, right? She's like this amazing Wonder Woman, right? My parents always say, you so married up, right? And it's so true. I did. I really married up. But just speaking in general here, how most people react to something like that, right? So, because she never brought up the fact that I didn't put the dishes away, to avoid it, or because she didn't want the conflict, now she is more prone to do that, not bring things up because she doesn't want the conflict, right? And so she's kind of an avoider, right? And so now, after I say, in this situation, after I'm say, I don't remember if I turned the iron off, and that bothered her, that answer bothered her, she might say something, as I said, like, well, you didn't do what I asked you to last week. Now, all of a sudden, our conflict has grown to include something else rather than just the iron. Now we're off onto the dishes from last week. And often this happens so quickly, it's hard to stop once it starts. You bring up something from the past, and then you're off down that rabbit trail. And this is why we should talk with the people in our relationships about this when the heat is dialed down. Because it's virtually impossible to talk about when the heat is dialed up, right? Over the years, I've learned a technique that I try and employ whenever I'm in conflict. I can't always do it. And this happened most recently when my dad and I got into an argument. We were arguing about a specific Bible verse and how to interpret it. I know that it's kind of stupid, but it's what men do. And my dad and I both have very strong opinions about Bible teachings, theology, so on and so forth, right? And it started off about the book of Proverbs, but before long, we were debating just about every part of Scripture that we disagreed with. Because it quickly went from this particular thing in Proverbs to, everything in the Bible, that we slightly disagree on now became this huge impetus for this massive conflict, right? But once I noticed this, I stopped. And I had to learn this over the years, and sometimes I still don't do it. I stopped for a moment, and this is what I said to my dad. I'm paraphrasing. I said, listen, Dad, I know that we disagree on the Proverbs issue, but we agree on a lot more of the Bible than we disagree on. So I am sorry for getting us sidetracked onto these other issues. When I did that, it took the heat out of the argument. Somebody has to be willing, whenever we're in an argument or conflict, in order to make it healthy, constructive, somebody has to be willing to take the burden on their shoulders. Because the truth is, I love my dad, but he is the one that brought up the other stuff. I took it on myself in order to stop the conflict or to minimize the damage of the conflict. So then as soon as I lowered my own temperature, it took the breath out of the conflict because I took it upon myself to get us back onto track, right? If we still wanted to discuss Proverbs, that's fine, we can, but let's narrow it back down to what we're originally talking about, right? And I'm not doing that to avoid conflict. I'm doing that in order to stay on topic, right? Now, I would have never been able to do that years ago, before I learned to manage my strong emotions, ever. Because when I got in a conflict, I would just see red, right? And I just want my way, right? I want to win. I was like we talked about in week 1, a very competitive person. I always had to win at all costs. And the Lord has helped me, and now I'm not, don't let me paint a picture here like I'm some perfect conflict person. I'm not, right? I could have my wife come up here and tell you that. But these are areas that the Lord has really worked on me, and I have learned a lot of things in these areas. So, I want to try to pass them on. So that's one. Staying on topic, very important. And if you have to take the burden on your shoulders to narrow it down back to the original topic, I believe that is a biblical principle, right? Taking one for the team. Now, that can go overboard. That can go overboard to where we're just seeking to please the other person, right? So there's like all things I talk about in doctrine, relationships, everything, balance is the key. If we have a person who's constantly trying to dominate us, to try to get us to back off, then in that situation, simply acquiescing to everything they say all the time, that's not healthy. I'm speaking of more healthy relationships, where it maybe gets a little out of pocket, this one particular, conflict, to take it upon ourselves in order to minimize the damage of the conflict. So staying on topic is very important. Here's the other one, is putting yourself in the other person's shoes, all right? So we'll get through this, and then we'll be done this week, and then next week we'll be set up to do the biblical principles behind all of this stuff, and we'll bring it all in together. So like the rest of these things that we talked about today, being able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person that you are having conflict with is not an easy task. It isn't. It's not an easy task. It requires us to unshackle ourselves from our worldview, which is oftentimes the hardest thing that you can ask a person to do, especially if the person is the type that believes they're always right? Very hard to unshackle that person from their own worldview. But in order to put ourselves in another person's shoes, that's one of the things that we have to do. Now, in some conflict, there is clearly a right and a wrong. Let me say that. In some conflict, there's clearly a right and a wrong. Other times, the arguments are about our preferences, right? Like we talked about in the first week, scarce resources, right? Or our own opinions about something. We're arguing about money, something like that, right? For example, a couple is arguing about how and where to spend money. The husband wants to build a fence around the property, and the wife wants to build a deck, right? So she can get the husband out there and cook, right? And you only have enough money for one project, only one. In this situation, there's no clear right and wrong, contrary to what probably the guy thinks. There is no clear right and wrong, right? This is a matter of opinion, or contrary, kind of rough on the guy there, or contrary to what the woman thinks, there is no clear right and wrong. I know just sometimes guys have more, not always, we plant our flags in the ground usually a lot quicker, but not always, not always. And so in this situation, there is no right and wrong. So it's important to remember that. So putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. On the other hand, let's say a close friend or one of your kids or grandkids suddenly announces that they are gay and they're marrying a person of the same sex. The family is split down ideological differences. There's going to be conflict. In this situation, there is a clear right and wrong. There is, right? But regardless of the situation, we should always seek to try to put ourselves in the shoes of the people we are having conflict with. What is driving them? Why is this bothering them so much? What have I done or said that is causing this conflict, right? Even when we're in situations where there is a clear right and wrong, we can always try, not that we'll change our ideology or our deeply held beliefs, we can always try looking at things from their perspective. Let's take the example that I just gave, the relative or friend who announced that they're gay, and they came to me and asked me if I would marry them. Obviously, I would say no. Obviously, that goes against everything that I stand for. It does. It goes against everything I stand for. This is how I usually approach conflicts like this. I actually got a little ahead of myself. This is how I approach conflicts like this. We walk a balanced line in our life with the Lord. We do. And as far as putting ourselves in another person's shoes. So this is what I always ask myself. If I do this thing, will it hurt my witness? If I put myself in their shoes and I understand their perspective from this, let's say family member's perspective, they want to get married, and I put myself in their shoes, even though I think it's wrong, I know it's wrong. How are they thinking about it? Well, they're not thinking about it from a spiritual perspective because they're not saved. That's right. So they can't think about it from a spiritual perspective, right? So they're thinking of it more of a civil rights issue, I promise you.
Yeah, of course.
They're thinking of, so here's the question I have to ask in any of these type of situations. What will do the minimum amount of damage to my witness? Okay? I would not marry them. Okay? Now, as a result, it will pretty much completely destroy me ever having a chance to talk to them about Christ, because they have labeled me now, for better or worse, a bigot or whatever, right? However, let's say that I did go marry them. That would destroy my witness with those that I serve, with those that other people in my life that are believers. It would do much more damage. And besides that, it's just wrong, right? It's just wrong. So now, but let's say, and I have this down, they didn't ask me to marry them. They asked me to just go to the wedding. This is a real life situation. It really is. And I think that in this type of situation, again, I would weigh what my witness would be. And I think I put down here, let's see, let me find it. I apologize real quick. So I have to think, if I don't go to the wedding, okay, maybe they won't think of it as severely as I said, I won't marry them. They'll still be mad at me. But I could still see an opportunity for the Lord for me to be able to come in sometime later and to be able to still have a relationship with them and be able to still share the Lord with them. In that case, I would not go to the wedding. But let's say I decided to go to a wedding because if I thought in my mind it would completely destroy the relationship 100%. Let's say that. What I would do in that case, now let me say clearly here, I'm not advocating going to a gay wedding. I'm trying to get you thinking. Let's say that I decided, yes, I was going to go. This is what I would do in that situation. I would go to Joe and Dean, because I have to think about, what will my witness look like if I go to a gay wedding as a pastor, not to marry them? What will my witness look like to those I serve? What will they think, right? Now, I'm not saying what will they think in order to please everyone. I'm saying what will they think in regard to how I'm viewed as a man of God and as a pastor. Or if some of you, as a woman of God, as Joe, as a man of God, And so what I would do in that situation is I would go to Joe and Dean. I would say, here's the situation. My nephew is getting married. He's asked me and Laura to come to the wedding. I would get counsel from them. What do you guys think? I weigh out both options. All right? If I don't go, because I'm very close with this nephew, more than likely it will ruin the relationship and I will never have another chance to talk with him again. on the other hand, if I go and if I'm not communicating that to those around me, and I just go clandestinely, if someone finds out that I went, but I didn't communicate it to anyone, that's damaging. So in that situation, let's just say if I decided to go, I would go to Joe and Dean, I would get counsel. Then what I would probably do is I would communicate what my motives and intentions are to you all. I want you to know that I'm going to be going to this. You all know how I stand on this situation. I am going to do it because I believe if I didn't, it would ruin my relationship and I would never be able to reach him again. So that's how I would approach it. Now, personally, I wouldn't go. But I'm just saying this, in my opinion, is on these personal conviction matters. Okay? On these personal conviction matters. It's important that when we're putting ourselves in another person's shoes, that we always seek counsel, that we're always 100% upright, that we communicate with the people around us in order so that it does not hurt our witness. That is what we have to keep in mind when we're putting ourselves in another person's shoes. I may have empathy for that person. I feel sad for that person, but if it's going to destroy my witness over here, I'm not going to do it. I'm just simply not going to do it. Some of these matters are personal convictions. Now, thankfully, hopefully, we don't have too many of those in our life. If we're constantly coming up against like those type of situations, man, I'm sorry about that. Those are tough. Those are the tough ones. In our general day-to-day relationships, though, thankfully, it's not a matter of morality or ruining our witness or something like that. It's a matter of us putting ourselves in the other person's shoes and saying, what is driving them right now? What is motivating them right now? Why does she want to build the deck rather than a fence? And why is she giving me a hard time about this? Well, then I come to find out the reason that she wants to do this because she wants to have more people over to the house in order to be able to enjoy time outside, to be able to entertain a little bit more, and all these number of things that I wouldn't have thought about because I just want the fence to keep my neighbors out, right? In that situation, I would say that it's incumbent upon us then, if our motivation is just to keep people out, and her motivation is to be able to entertain and bring people in, guess who's probably should get their way in that situation? The woman, more than likely, right? But it takes a strong person in order to lay down what we want. But when we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, it can be easier to do that. It can be easier to do that. So that is what I have for you this week. Next week, we will bring it all home with biblical principles. I will have a PowerPoint, which again, and by the way, I'll tell you that's kind of a control issue. It is. You may not view it as control, but to me it's a control issue. Because I like to be able to control what's going on behind me when I preach or teach. And so it's probably good for me not to have a PowerPoint. So I still don't like it though. So there's that. So anyway, anybody have...
Put ourselves in your shoes.
Thank you.